I want to welcome you back to the book of Ecclesiastes and chapter 5. And such a wealth of wisdom in these writings of Solomon. The only regretful thing is that Solomon did not listen to his own teachings. But here in chapter 5, there is an admonition and a warning that when we are in the house of God, we should listen rather than make the sacrifice of fools. And essentially, many people come into the house of God and they make very rash promises. And sometimes after a time they forget what they promised God, but God does not forget. And I'd like to give this illustration. I used to be in Switzerland, and there the president of our work was praying one day, and he said, "Oh, it is a very hard field." And the Lord took him back in a kind of a vision of the night to when he was in Canada, in Montreal, and there in the moving of the Spirit, he had come forward to consecrate his life as a young man to the Lord, and he cried out to the Lord, "Oh Lord, send me to the hardest place on earth." And the Lord said, "I'm just fulfilling your prayer." So we have to be very careful what we promise God in a moment of emotion. In fact, it is very clear in verse 5, Solomon said, "It's better that you should not vow than that thou shouldest vow and not pay." In other words, let our words be very few. We're told to listen and that our words should be few, but we should be swift to hear. In James chapter 1 and verse 19, slow to speak, swift to hear. And in reality, when we come into the presence of God, it's more important to hear what He has to say to us than what we have to say to Him. And so, in prayer, whether it be, in the house of God, or whether it be a devotion, or whether it be walking along the road, it is to have a hearing ear. Lord, what have you got to say to me? And be very careful about making rash promises. And some people tend to bargain with the Lord. And they say, "Now, look, Lord, if you will do this for me, I will do that for you." Well, that again is very foolish indeed. And so often one promises to do more than one can. And again, that is very silly. And in verse 6, it says, "Suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin. Neither say thou before the angel that it was an error." We must never forget that in the house of God, although unseen, there are many angels. Angels govern the church. Angels are in the service to instruct us, to lead us, to watch over us. And so in reality, when we're coming to the altar and we make a promise, there's the angel standing there. Then afterwards, Solomon says, "Now don't go and say to him it was a mistake." because why should God be angry and destroy the work of thine hands? And then he goes on with this warning, for in the multitude of dreams and many words, there are also divers vanities, but fear thou God. You know, in Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 19, there is a clear-cut warning that in the multitudes of words there wanteth not sin. The wise man keeps his lips closed and listens very carefully before giving an opinion. And, it's very strange, but in verse 3 it says, a fool's voice is known by the multitude of words. Someone who is constantly speaking is classified as a fool. And so we want to be classified as the wise. And so here is the first lesson in this session. Watch our words with all diligence. Practice not opening your mouth. Listening to others, be swift to hear, because sometimes God speaks to us through other members of the body. For example, in Ephesians, it says we are nourished by that which every joint supplieth. And so God sometimes speaks through people, and we miss hearing what he says to our detriment. And so that is the first lesson. Be swift to hear, slow to speak. And when you're in the house of the Lord or when you're praying, be very careful about promising God things. It's far better not to vow. In fact, Jesus made the point, he said, let your yea be yea and your nay, nay. Other than that, it's sinful. So that lesson is very important indeed. Now then, he changes the subject. And he said, if thou seest the oppression of the poor, and violent perverting of judgment and justice in the province, marvel not at the matter, for he that is higher than the highest regardeth there be higher than he. In other words, he's saying Christ sees it, and the one higher than Christ, God the Father, also sees it. But there is a lesson here that when we do see somebody oppressed, if it is in our power, we should alleviate that oppression. Now, sometimes it is in our power, sometimes it isn't in our power. For example, somebody carrying a heavy suitcase. Well, it is in your power to help them, to alleviate that pressure, that oppression on them. But sometimes you can't, because the oppression comes from another quarter and you don't have the power nor authority to change it. But you can pray that God will change the hearts of kings, that God will change those in authority over those people and alleviate the oppression that they have put on them. So this thought of oppression doesn't mean that we are to disregard another's status, but rather, if possible, we are to alleviate and help them. But if not, if we cannot, if it's not in our power, we can pray. And prayer changes things. I remember a certain, shall I call him academic doctor anyway, and he was telling me, that a certain government department was refusing a certain request that he felt was very legitimate. And he said, prayer changes things. And so they went to prayer, and soon they had a letter, not from that government department, but from the secretary. The secretary, the government cabinet minister, over that department, saying, we have granted your request. We have granted your request. So prayer does change things. I remember when I was going into Switzerland, and the road from France to Switzerland goes out of Switzerland, goes into France, goes into Switzerland again. That's how it works. And so I was perfectly legal, going into Switzerland. But I had to come out of Switzerland, go into France, and it's only a few miles, but then back into Switzerland. And then, we had to give up our passports in those days, and they were examined by an inspector of police. And he said to me, your name is on every frontier of France, that you must not enter this country. I said, what? He said, what have you been doing? He said, who are you? Why, I said, I'm a pastor. I don't know what's happened. So he phoned up the governor, equivalent of governor of New York or something like that, to ask what the governor said. And the governor said, well, make him sign a letter that he will not enter France again. Well, I had no option. And then I went into Switzerland, and there was a convention, and the Spirit of God moved in a very powerful way. And I was very concerned about this. I was very young, and to get to England, if I wanted to go back to England, I had to pass through France. They would have put me in prison. And I prayed. And then I received a letter from a certain official in France. You have been granted a visa for, I think it was 11 or 10 years. I thought, this is wonderful. Prayer changes things. And so I had to go back by the very pathway that I'd come into Switzerland by car, and the very same inspector was there. His face got so red, so angry. He said, didn't we tell you not to come into France? You'll be under arrest. And so I pulled out from my pocket this letter and waved it to him. Please read it. And he read it. Oh, he said, okay. And then I went to see the official that wrote the letter. And I said, whatever happened? Well, he said, I didn't like the English, so I put your name on the forbidden list to come into France. I said, Well, I said, what made you change your mind? Well, he said, having put that there, I had to inform the British consul. The British consul near to the general, near to the ambassador, didn't come to me, but he went to the governor of the province, and he said, how dare you do this to a pastor? And the governor came upon me and said, issue him a visa immediately. He said, there you are. Well, I had done nothing but cried out to God. God changes things. God changes things. The oppressor's power is broken. And we must remember that God sees everything. And God saw the children of Israel oppressed, but of course it was God who stirred up the Pharaoh to oppress them for his purposes. They cried unto him. He said, I have seen and heard. He sends Moses. In other words, prayer changes things. And if, we can't help somebody, we can at least pray and God comes in the scene. All right, that's lesson number 2. Now, lesson number 3 is somewhat different. It's moreover the profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is served by the field. And there God gives the earth for our pleasure, for our nourishment, and we should be thankful for it. And if we walk in uprightness before him, he gives the seasons in their due time, and the result is we are nourished by the earth. But then it changes, and King Solomon considers what people seek during their lifetime. And this is a very important truth. And he says, he that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loveth abundance with increase. And then he goes on to say, when goods increase, they are increased that eat them. And what good is there to the owners thereof, saving the beholding of them with their eyes? And it's very true. The thought is, and it said elsewhere, woe to him that addeth field to field. In other words, why seek after riches? Because, it's so difficult, with riches. They trouble the sleep of the owners thereof. And what do riches do? I remember a certain British person who was really a multi-millionaire coming up for a billionaire, and he would own racehorses, he owned an airline, and so forth. And he was asked by some journalists, what are you going to do next with all your money? And he said, really, there are only certain things in life that a person can have. After that, there's nothing worth having. And he loved racing, so he got horses. He loved flying, so he got an airline. But in actuality, he said, those things do not satisfy. They do not satisfy. My wife and I were round a stove in a parsonage where we lived, being pastor of an evangelical church. And the Lord's Spirit came upon us, and the Lord started to speak through us and say, the one thing that everybody seeks is happiness. But they think it's in the accumulation of riches, or having many houses, or this, that, and the other. He said, everybody seeks the same thing. But we should understand where true happiness comes from. And it is not in the acquisition of things. And he says this very clearly. You see, he that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver. He that loveth abundance with increase, that also is vanity. What really satisfies? Well, from a secular point of view, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eat little or much. But the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. And I've known some very rich people in my life, and I've known some very rich people, but never content. Never content. I remember a certain Prime Minister of England, Harold Macmillan, and he attained unto the premiership, highest political office in England. And then when he became sick and had to retire, he said in Italian to his wife, il comito è finita. In other words, the play is over. It did not satisfy him. And then he became Chancellor of Oxford University. And when he was there, he said, well, this satisfies me more than the Prime Ministership of England. But then that didn't satisfy him. He had to go back into business because he was attached to the publishing firm of Macmillan and Brothers, and they brought out an encyclopedia on music. And you know, this gentleman of such, shall I say, talents, he spent the rest of his life going around trying to sell this encyclopedia to colleges and so forth. And he had no satisfaction whatsoever. No satisfaction whatsoever. No, you look for happiness in politics, the academic, or business, there's no satisfaction. All right. And then the point that Solomon brings out is this. Look, if you have a son, he comes into the world naked, he goes out naked. He doesn't take anything with him. And in reality, it's the same for each one of us. We came in having nothing, and we go out having nothing. Therefore, the question is, why do we labor for that which is the wind? What profit hath a man, in verse 16, for all his labor? And in essence, King Solomon said, look, and Paul said virtually the same thing. If you've got clothing, if you have that which is to eat, you have that which is to drink, well, then that is something that you should indeed appreciate from God and indeed be happy about. And the interesting thing in verse 20, he says, for he shall not much remember the days of his life. In other words, afterwards, speaking of those who are in secular employment and not Christians, well, their life is over, and that's it. Now, it's not a very, shall I say, cheerful passage, not a very happy chapter. But for the Christian, it is quite different. Number one, Solomon says to the person in the world, what does your abundance profit? Seeking after silver won't make you happy, and abundance won't make you happy. In other words, just be content with a quiet life. But for the Christian, it's different. The Christian is different. The Christian has other goals, and the Christian is after other acquisitions. Now let us consider what the Word of God says concerning the Christian life. Number one, in Proverbs 11, verse 30, he that winneth souls is wise. Therefore, the more souls we win, the more content and the more happy we shall be. The more people we influence in life, the happier, the more joyful we shall be. For the Christian, abundance is joy. And I remember, when I first came to the United States, my father-in-law had a house and quite a bit of ground. And so, that's where we stayed when we first came. And there was a field, a very large field. And that field was full of grass. That's all that was done. It wasn't very profitable. It was just full of grass. Because basically, he nor his daughters wanted to spend their time, in that field. So he just left it like that. But as I walked in that field, I saw all this grass. It was thick with grass. And then this scripture came to me. In Job chapter 5 and verse 25. So shall thy seed be as the grass of the field. In other words, it was going to please God that I would influence many people. That was his pleasure. And then the Lord Jesus, speaking from the fruit of the vine in John 15, he says, I am the true vine, my Father is the husbandman, ye are the branches. And he said, the branch brings forth fruit, more fruit, and much fruit. And he said, my Father is glorified in bringing forth much fruit. And therefore, the more people we impact in life for good and turn them into the ways of righteousness, the more the Father is glorified. And so you see, the Christian life is so different to the normal life of one in the world. Solomon, addressing the one in the world, says, and in a sense we are all in the world, he said, look, it's no good acquiring all these things. Have you ever moved and you wonder what you've accumulated all the time you're in that house? And you wonder what you're going to do with it? And are you going to take it with you, or are you going to cull it? There was a certain pastor's wife, and we knew the son-in-law who was a pastor and his wife too. And she had a serious operation. And she started calling her children and started giving away some of the knickknacks she had accumulated in her life. And this pastor's wife said to me, that is a sign of death. It is a realization we cannot take it with us, and so we give it away. It has no real value. And the people receiving these knickknacks, really don't need them, and they take them out of courtesy. So, in a very real sense, you see, the things of this world we should hold very lightly. But spiritual things, quite different attitude. And in the spiritual, you see, unlike the natural, the spiritual things are eternal. Everything that we have done here will be reckoned up in heaven. Every act of kindness, every word of encouragement, every, shall I say, way that we have helped a person shall be remembered. Everything we do for Christ, and that is another interesting thing, everything we do for Christ. He said, if you do this for the least of one of these, you're doing it for me. And so you see, we want to accumulate. We want an abundance of good works. We don't want to go into heaven, in a sense of paucity, being very poor, having not done much in this earth. No, we are the exact reverse of what Solomon has advocated for somebody in this world. We are the exact reverse. Everything we do for one another and for Christ counts. It is not left behind. It is recorded in heaven, and a reward is waiting for every little thing that we have done for Christ. And so you see, we are so different to the people of this world. The people of this world have worked hard so often, for things and to get money, to get houses and so forth. But on their deathbed, they've got to leave it all. And that's another interesting thing. There's a eulogy given when a person dies, and the interesting thing, it is what is said at that eulogy. I have never heard a eulogy where someone who's dead, lying there, is praised for all the riches he has acquired. No, even the eulogy of the people of this world follow the same pattern. He was a good husband, he was a good father, he was a righteous man, he cared for us. Basically, those are the qualities that are mentioned in the funeral parlor or in the church as eulogy. It's not his education, it's nothing like that at all. It's what kind of a man he was and what impact did he have on other people. The world realizes this. Yet when they're living, they congratulate someone on the wealth he has attained. It's amazing. But when it comes to the funeral, no, he was a good husband, good father, he cared for his children, and also he did this and this for other people. But you see, for us as Christians, we want to acquire all the good works that we possibly can. Every time we have an opportunity to help someone, let us do it as though we're doing it for Christ. And actually we are. The Lord was speaking to me about a certain situation. And he said that person is oppressed. And he said, if you can alleviate that oppression, you're doing it to me. And the Word of God says in Isaiah that in all the afflictions of the children of Israel, he was afflicted. And so when we are helping someone, a Christian or others, but basically a Christian, we are actually helping Jesus. If we're helping to lift a load from someone, we're helping him in his affliction, for he is feeling the oppression of that person. And so we want to remember this, that in a very real sense, we are so different from the people of this world. Solomon says to the people of this world, what is the use of you accumulating all these things? You can't take it with you. And if you get more and more things and people. This is something I don't understand, you see, logically. You know, a person has, for example, a business. And that business is prospering. And that business is, you know, giving a revenue that keeps that person comfortable. But you know, that person looks over the wall and wants to acquire another business. You know, what in actuality are they acquiring? Headaches. Because that other business will give them added headaches on top of what they already have. And yet they don't understand those things. It's so wonderful to be content with little in this world. And then, you see, that is this world. And so whilst we're in this world, let us heed to the warnings and admonition of Solomon. Let us not get in over our head. You know, some people want to do this. They borrow, and get in over their head, and then they sink. No, let us divide the secular and the spiritual. The secular, we want to indeed keep to the minimum, but the spiritual to the maximum. And then you see, at the eulogy, yes, he was a good husband, a good father, and so forth. And he did all these things for so many. And so many will testify of the good works that you did. And those things are not forgotten. They are remembered. The secular, they forget their life. But the spiritual remember. And there is a remembrance of everything that we did for good in this life. And I want to encourage you, you know, to be an abundant Christian, an abundant one, influencing many, many people, because every person you influence for good, that will be remembered when you go to heaven, and there will be an appropriate reward. And so may God, you know, be thanked that our lives can be lived with purpose, whereas the people of this earth have no purpose. But may God grant that our eyes will be open and that we will indeed see opportunities where we can help others and so have an abundance of good works as we enter the kingdom of heaven. God bless you. May you indeed be abundant in good works, and may your offspring or the people that you have influenced be like the grass of the field. When you go out of here, look at the grass. It's abundant everywhere. And may God grant that the people that you influence will be likewise abundant. God bless you.